Thank you, Ange, and thanks so much to everyone for being here today. It really is such an important event, and it's we're so proud of the research that we have been able to put together here, and I think that it is absolutely critical at this time. And speaking to the points that Ange just raised around, you know, how diabolical the consequences of climate-related disasters have been in this country recently, but they are only kind of set to get worse. So it is really high time that we put this lens on it. I also want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land we're on, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And now I would really like to introduce our panel, who are so unbelievably equipped to talk to what we've just heard from Ange as well, and to delve further into the research and points that have been raised, share some of their own thoughts on the realities for women in Australia with climate change, as well as the innovation and social impact that women are demonstrating right now, often in the face of numerous challenges and pushback. So, Sarina Kilham, can I get everyone, the panellists, to come up? So Sarina is an agricultural extension sociologist and a lecturer at Charles Sturt University, specialising in urban food policies. She has 20 years' experience working in United Nations peacekeeping missions, government, universities and global organisations, such as Human Rights Watch and Oxfam. She is also currently running as an independent candidate for the New South Wales election. Sophia Hamblin Wang is a circular economy expert, speaker, diversity advocate and chief operating officer of MCI Carbon. And Ange was just talking about the rate of green tech founders being female, and Sophia is 100% one to watch in this space. MCI Carbon is an Australian-based global clean technology transforming CO2 emissions into building materials and other valuable industrial products for the circular economy. She is also a World Economic Forum young global leader, and she's been featured in the Australian Fin Review, ABC's Q&A, the New York Times, Time Magazine, TEDx, and just to add to it, she has also been named in the Australian's top 100 green power players in 2022 and 2023. And Larissa Waters is the first Green Senator for Queensland. She took office in 2011. She's currently Greens leader in the Senate and national spokesperson on women and democracy. She is an advocate, a fierce advocate, I should say, for equality, integrity and environmental justice. I want to ask you all about catalysts, because you have all been heavily involved in climate change action in various ways, in policy, in politics, in tech innovation. But I want to ask just quickly, what compelled you to contribute to this space and to help shift the conversation? I might start with you.
Thanks so much, Tarla, and I'll just start by adding my acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in the ACT region, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, so this is, just like the rest of the country, Aboriginal land, and it always will be. And I'm hopeful that we might actually see some progress, not just on voice, but also on truth and treaty in this term of Parliament, which is long overdue and very heartwarming. It's really lovely to be here, and I just finished reading this report on the plane, and it's incredible. It's a fantastic synthesis of all of the data on the impacts of climate on women. So if you haven't yet had a chance to read it, please make the time. It's gripping reading, and it will resonate with you as it did with me, and as it will with probably most women, and hopefully also some blokes as well. In terms of what motivated me to try to protect the environment, I'm an environmental lawyer by training. I used to go bushwalking with my parents as a youngster. I had a really formative trip to the Great Barrier Reef when I was 11, so my dad's a scientist. And the beauty of the natural world has always been an inspiration for me. And I've always thought that greed was the ultimate selfishness. And so we see patriarchy and capitalism working together to trash this finite, beautiful planet that we're on. And I've always thought it was my job as a citizen of this world to try to fight against that and protect all the creatures that we share this planet with, and to protect what we can pass on to the next generation.
So I guess when I read the report and reflected upon this panel, I really wanted to simplify who I am so that I could just say, hey, this is why I got into this space. But I realise I'm a bit of a complex being, and if you'll bear with me, there's a couple of things that happened in my life that contribute to why I think some of my insights are interesting. The first thing is that I grew up on the Great Barrier Reef in far north Queensland, so I'm from near Mission Beach. Yeah. So yeah, very, very lucky to have grown up in pristine, beautiful nature. But I did live in a caravan with my mum and my auntie and my grandpa for the first 6 years of my life there, and really experienced community, really, really great community. Then my home got hit by 2 Category 5 cyclones, Cyclone Larry and Cyclone Yasi in 2006 and 2011. And that was quite traumatic. By that time, my mum owned a house, but our house just got totally trashed twice. And seeing my mother, who is an aged care pensioner now, have to pay between $4,000 and $5,000 a year in insurance on her house is really significant, right? It's a huge cost that she's having to do. And then, so normally I would always just talk about that because I love where I'm from, but I also lived through the bushfires, just like most of you, but I lived through it as a renter in Canberra, where we had just a significant amount of smoke for 3 months or more, where I wasn't able to get my landlords to ensure that our house was smoke-proof. And I lived through that whilst also being on the ACT Climate Change Council. And so I was getting a lot of data and experiences coming through talking about how we needed to create smoke refuges for the citizens of the ACT, why some of those smoke refuges weren't accessible to all people, and realising that there's all of these unintended consequences in life that are starting to happen that we just don't know what new, fresh challenges we're going to have tomorrow. And so, sorry, but in terms of catalysts, I got into working in climate tech because I really do think that we need to create business models and robust new systems in order to get to a net zero future. But I have stayed and remain extremely passionate about this area because I've lived through 3 very significant climate events in my life so far.
Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where I live, work, play and raise my family, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I would like to acknowledge that it's stolen land, and it's only through their millennia of care for country that I'm able to enjoy that country and raise my family there. I'd also just like to say thanks to Ange at the beginning for getting a bit emotional and teary, because we are not going to solve the climate crisis just through tech and the idea of us being logical, irrational human beings. We have to bring our whole human being to this issue, and that means being emotional, getting teary, being able to appreciate beauty and being able to cry and have that full breath, because that our entire humanness is what's going to solve it, not just part of our rational minds. So I grew up with hippie parents in a small, I don't even want to call it a town, but on the lands of the Biripi people on the edge of the Wallace Lake in Booty Booty National Park. an area that's known on the mid-north coast as New South Wales as Wollamba. So connection with nature has always been a really key part of my identity. It certainly was as a child. And then in my 20s and my 30s, my early 30s, I got much more interested in social and political change. And I did a lot of work around sustainability, but I had really stepped away from the term climate change. It didn't resonate with me. I didn't see that the work that I was doing really fell under climate change. And then I kind of had this epiphany, I think it was maybe about 8 years ago, where I was like, all the issues that I'm interested in, all the things that I've been working on for my entire life around social sustainability, around agriculture, around rural livelihoods, these are all connected under the umbrella of climate crisis. And unless I start thinking about that bigger umbrella of climate crisis, then I can't make headway on these as separate little issues. So, and that for me, I mean, having children and just re-embracing that term, a term that I had felt very alienated from, I guess has kind of put me on the current pathway. But it does go back to that connection. I hear that from all of us, as connection with nature as kids.
Okay, I want to go into the research and some of the alarming trends that we have clearly analysed in this report, as well as other global studies, including the broader social and health impacts of climate change that we're just not addressing in Australia right now. Women's health and welfare is acutely at risk during climate crises, with upticks in domestic and family violence, vulnerable living circumstances, homelessness, financial insecurity, mental health decline. How do we make sure that climate change is treated as the health and social emergency that it clearly is? Larissa.
Love this question. Our current political system takes such a reductionist approach to things, and really the lesson that we should be learning from the climate crisis is that everything is interlinked, and if we don't tackle poverty, then we can't tackle the climate crisis. If we don't tackle gender inequality, we can't tackle the climate crisis. If we don't make sure everyone has got a home and everyone's got access to free mental health care, then we can't tackle the climate crisis. So I fear that our political system is not by its nature used to dealing with such complex and interlinked problems, and certainly not very good at doing that. We need to get better at doing that. So I think we really need to take a holistic approach. I think we need more women around the decision-making table. I agree, we need more emotion and more realness in these debates, and like you, Angela, that was the bit that brought me to tears on the plane, is reading about the kids' trauma response. You can't not read that as a parent and relate to it on a deep level. And I think tapping into that passion and that compassion is really crucial in decision making. And we need science to be guiding those decisions, but humanity needs to be there too. And I fear also for the ability of our political system to make decisions based on science and based on the public interest when we have so many big coal and gas companies making massive donations to the re-election campaigns of so many of the political parties. So we need some systems fixes so that we can get better decisions, and then we need some decisions that reflect the lived experience of people, like lifting job seeker. Because as you mentioned, and as this report so beautifully encapsulates, it's people that are already living on floodplains in homes that they can barely afford, who are going to get trashed the next time it floods, who have the least ability to rebuild, the least options to relocate. So we actually need to put a social and economic lens on our climate response as well as a scientific one. I think they're the main points that I wanted to make, but I could not recommend this report more highly for distilling just the fact that climate and gender is impacting everything. And I might just add on the health response. We saw in the health pandemic, in COVID, how much pressure was put on our childcare educators, our early childhood educators, on nurses, on highly feminised industries. And so not only were these workers who were incredibly, were holding up the system at work, they were also bearing all of the trauma and stress and extra responsibility at home. And so it's no wonder that we now have an exodus of nursing professionals from that industry because they're exhausted, they're burnt out. And that's going to happen time and time again. And particularly sticking with health, as we see more vector-borne diseases and the other kind of physical impacts of the climate crisis on people's health, more of the heat waves, that pressure and stress on our healthcare system is going to increase. So not only do we need to be paying those workers more, but I would love to see a less feminised industry. And it's ironic that every time we see a feminised industry, you see a lower average gender pay than you do for male-dominated industries. So we've just got to start valuing women's work, whether it's paid work or whether it's unpaid work, because we are holding up the economy and we are part of the solution to the climate crisis.
I'll go to you on that question, Sophia, and then I've got a separate social question for you.
So in my experience, what we've been trying to do is stop emissions from going into the atmosphere. And at the end of the day, that's helping us to create a net zero future. We talk a lot about 1.5 degrees as a goal, but I think people have really lost track of what that actually means. It really means like a 2100 that is more prosperous for future generations. And I think that the system currently isn't really valuing, isn't really accounting for the true cost of business, right? So one of the points that I wanted to make around this is that people who are entrenched in the systems, a lot of fossil fuel companies, but not only, are trying to continue business as usual as long as possible because of self-interest. And I think that what we know is that diversity in decision-making, not only in politics but also in business, does equate to more holistic outcomes. And so that's something that we absolutely need to ensure progress is made on. There has been a bit of progress, but absolutely not enough. So we know that as 40% of climate tech have female founders, amazing, that's great. Are they getting funded in the same ways? Because female-led tech companies get far less funding from venture capital firms. So there's so many different problems to be solved all at once, and I think that women are very well placed to be attacking those problems.
Sarina, I want to go to you, and Ange was talking about this a little bit in terms of the vulnerability that people with disabilities have during climate disaster. I know you've done some work in the space of disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. Our research points to that severe gap that I just mentioned, and despite women with disabilities being especially exposed to climate impacts, Australia's response is really quite dismal at the moment. I think we're one of very few countries that don't have a strategy implemented in the Paris Agreement. So, and obviously we are a place of extreme weather events. What are some of the things that we need to do here that you have seen overseas, as well as for other vulnerable groups?
In relation to disasters?
In relation to disasters, yeah.
Yeah. So I was part of a research project many years ago now, and I think it was originally in around 2013 to 2015 that looked at disability inclusive disaster risk reduction. And this project initially was in Indonesia and then has actually moved back to Australia. And it was really centred on the idea that people with disabilities have incredible amounts of knowledge because they already are often the most vulnerable in their communities. So they have huge amounts of strategies and huge amounts of knowledge of what it means to be vulnerable. And so if you can get people with disabilities on, for example, community-led disaster risk reduction committees or informing disaster risk reduction policies, then you know what it's going to be like when the rest of that whole community starts to become vulnerable because of an external disaster. And that research had shown that the disaster risk reduction plans, when they included people with disabilities, were stronger and had better outcomes for the entire community. And so I think you can extrapolate some of those findings to say, are the most vulnerable in our wider society being included in how we're thinking, planning, addressing for disasters? And at the moment, the answer is no. And what would it look like if we started to include the most vulnerable people to have powerful voices in how we think, plan and address our disaster planning? I think it would be really revolutionary.
That would mean that the rate of old white men would have to actually step down. So.
It's not pie, remember?
Larissa, we have talked a little bit about what needs to be done, and we're only a few months into a new government. Do you feel that there is willingness and appetite from this government to heed the warnings here?
We've got a little bit of ScoMo trauma there with that reference to women not rising at the expense of men, or whatever that just cringy reference was that so typified the last 9 years of the federal government. I do feel hopeful because we are in a new chapter, and I draw on my natural optimism because you have to in this day and age. But I do feel hopeful that at least we have more women in Parliament now. We still need to work a lot more on diversity. We still need more women of colour. We still need more people with disabilities and people from different professional and non-professional backgrounds. But we are, at least in the Senate now, we're 57% women, and you can feel the difference. You really can. The House has still got a bit of work to do. I think they're only not even 40% women yet. But look, I'm hopeful. I think what we just saw in the election was a really strong sentiment from the community that they want these issues taken seriously. They want climate addressed, they want poverty and inequality addressed, and they want gender equality addressed. So I think any government that fails to read that memo and read the room will really miss some opportunity to make some reforms that will improve people's material daily lives. So I feel optimistic from that perspective. I mean, we've still got entrenched political influence. As I mentioned before, there's still big fossil fuel influence, sadly, over Parliament and over the individual politicians. You still see a lot of people go off to work for, the gas representative body when they leave Parliament. There's still really cosy relationships there that I think are clouding the judgment, particularly on climate matters. We still have essentially vulture capitalism running our democracy, which in my view is really meaning worse impacts, worse outcomes for ordinary people. And you're so right to mention that when you have diversity in decision making, you get better decisions. You get decisions that work better for everyone. It's kind of a pretty obvious point, but our Parliament still doesn't look like our community. But yes, I am optimistic. We've seen an increase in climate ambition from the government. It's sadly not up to scratch with what the science says it needs to be. And I don't want to be too political here, but our party will keep pushing for there to be not any more approvals for coal or gas. Like, we can quibble about how quickly you transition away from existing fossil fuels, but surely you should not be opening new coal and gas with the information that we currently have. I don't understand why that's such a hot potato for the other parties. But anyway, thank you. It seems so kind of base level to us. We'll keep pushing for that, and really, in fact, the next month will probably give us the answer to whether or not we'll see any movement on that. But you have to be optimistic, and there's a lot of really good progress being made. There's a lot of great innovation in the renewable energy sector. A lot of this is happening. There's a lot of global trends that even if we've got a slightly less brave government than we deserve, I still think that the change is happening. The question for me is it going to happen fast enough for us to still have a Great Barrier Reef? And the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees for me is a reef or not, which is really confronting for someone that feels that we don't have the right to decimate the natural world. So, yeah, but I have to remain optimistic, and there's a lot of good stuff happening. There's a lot of fantastic young women advocates in the climate space, including some of the people on the panel here. And I take a lot of heart from the fact that Greta Thunberg is now an international kind of opinion leader. I love that. You would not have predicted that 15 years ago. And I know, and does these great takedowns of these total douchebags. So, go Greta.
On that note of optimism, Sophia, I do want to turn to you because I know that you are optimistic still, and you obviously in the space that you're in, that is very helpful. Having attended COP26 in Glasgow and being named one of World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders for 2022, you do epitomise youth innovation and expertise. How do we make sure that we are better leveraging young people and young women, especially in this space?
So, some experiences that I've had, I've benefited a lot from being lifted up by other people, particularly women, but not only women. And so, my main point would be to lift up other women and encourage young women in particular to reach for excellence. I had a couple of experiences I'd like to share. One of them is I spoke on a panel at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2020. It was like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I got invited to speak on a panel with all of these global leaders in the hardest to abate sectors, because the work that I do is decarbonising the hard to abate and convincing the hard to convince. So I already knew, it might be a bit of a tough crowd, but there was like the presidents and prime ministers of some very significant countries. It was a Chatham House, so I can't mention who they are. But anyway, I sat in the room and I was going to talk about how we can transform carbon emissions into new products for the circular economy. It's part of the transition. When I looked around the room, I actually realised that I was one of the only women in the room, in a large room. And I realised that I was the only person definitely who looked like me as well. So it wasn't in lots of different ways. And usually I would have felt like an imposter because I know we all suffer from imposter syndrome, I assume quite a lot. But what I actually realised is that that difference was a real point of strength, because if you are the only person in the room who comes from your perspective, then you really do need to speak up for the person that you are and for your background. And that was an incredibly empowering moment for me. And it made me realise that I need to encourage all of the other people around me who also feel imposter syndrome or similar feelings to really find empowerment in those moments. What that has led to, though, is me realising about this, I don't know what sort of load it is, climate load, mental load, but there is this diversity load that we get, where I sit in rooms all the time now and I think, who isn't being spoken for here? And then I have to use my 1 question out of 5 to call that out. And I don't find that people who are holding the power are yielding any of their question time to say, where's the Indigenous voice here? Where's the multicultural, or so I guess that's one of my main points. And then finally, regarding COP26, that was a really tough time, right? Australia had just committed to net zero by 2050, which was way too late, like a 2015 target. But I'm also I'm a really optimistic person, and I think progress deserves acknowledgement, and I know that it wasn't easy to get to that stage. So I was like, wow, well done to get here. Let's get moving, right? We've been working on our technology this whole time. Now that you've stepped up to the table, let's see what we can do. And actually, stepping out onto the COP26 stage, we had an unbelievable amount of support, and the world press and also industrial companies were lining up to support our technology because we had been working on it all this time. But it was really hard because I felt so demoralised beforehand, because it was like, we haven't made enough progress, but then also you need to show optimism and keep up that hope and keep up the energy. Sorry, I don't think that I've explained it very well, but we won #1 clean tech at COP26 at that time, and it really, thank you. And it's because we were like, let's get on with it. Let's, great, Australia's here. We're gonna help to reduce emissions, and bringing that energy meant that I think a lot more Australian, maybe I'd say a lot more Australian, even politicians, but people of note were energised by it too.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is a big gap in the funding and support that female enterprise in this space gets. And I want to ask Sarina, maybe you can answer this as well as a candidate running in the New South Wales government, whether or not there is anything that can be done at a policy level to better support women in this space, especially when we see the kind of seismic gaps in VC funding.
I personally have not turned my mind to this, but of course there's something that can be done, because who's in government holds the power, and who holds the power writes the policies, and they also determine the funding and where you push funding. And if we know that women who are leading startups, who are in entrepreneurship, who are stepping out there in terms of tech innovation in this space are not getting enough funding, it seems to me that would be a fairly direct policy change that could have big impacts very quickly. It's a no-brainer kind of answer, yeah?
Just 2 points on that. There's a pipeline problem with women leading climate techs and women leading engineering companies, right? We need to ensure that there's more girls studying maths, and which leads to women studying engineering and technology at university, which then means they work up their careers and then end up leading companies. So obviously fixing that pipeline and ensuring that people don't end up dropping out during that time. On my lived experience as someone who's leading a company, I just had a baby, and my partner and I have had to fight the system where he actually works for the Federal Public Service, and he wasn't able to take primary parental leave because it's only available to the birth-giving parent. Yeah, it's
too late.
It's getting fixed, but it hasn't been in my, I gave birth 5 months ago, so that is a really hard problem. And then one other thing about policy. Oh, yes. So the founder thing is great, but I think we have to be just stare ourselves a little bit. Being a founder is one person. Companies are not created in vacuums. It's not just this one messiah and everyone follows them. Companies are created by teams. And if you look at teams that create great companies, women are very, very important parts of that. And so I feel like just focusing on founders, you'll have policy gaps and issues. But looking at founding teams, that's where the true data will be. Yeah. Sorry, which one do I use? There we go.
I just want to add a few things to that. And firstly, props to you for having a 5-month-old and still being able to string a sentence together. That is quite impressive. You're doing great. And also just on the paid parental leave, that is a long overdue fix that's been needed. There's been just a sexist approach to paid parental leave. At least we call it paid parental leave now, not maternity leave. But yeah, that's actually coming before the Senate on Monday, and we're hoping to make, sadly, not quite enough progress, but small amount of progress. And yeah, we'll aim to push on that a little bit more, because we do need men to do more at home so that we can do more at work and not just be really, really busy and tired all the time. But just coming to the policy issues of how we can support women in the sector and to be leading this transition, I guess I look at it less from a private sector perspective and more from a government perspective. I would love to see more government investment in renewable technology and doing that planning work to actually transition our economy, doing that work with communities to ask them what should come next. when that coal-fired power station is hopefully closing sooner than its lifespan, because we have options and we need to make that transition. So involving women in the community in those decisions will be crucial, and we've got a proposal to do that with a national transition authority that would set up local consultation boards with community, because I think we can't leave workers or communities behind in the transition. I think there's been a resistance in some of those coal towns to date about transitioning because they're worried about where their money's going to come from, which is a perfectly reasonable fear to have. And so making sure we bring people with us and say, hey, here's this other job, or here's these other 4 options that will pay as well, will make that transition less scary, and therefore there'll be less political resistance. But yeah, sorry, just to spell out the obvious there. But there's a few other things that the government could do. They've got procurement policies. They could be just saying, well, unless you have a gender equal board or unless you have no gender pay gap, you won't get our government contracts. They don't say that already, which frankly I think is disappointing, because it's an easy fix. We gather that data about gender pay gap. There's a national agency whose job it is to do that. They do a great job. So we've got those figures. We know who those companies are. Unless you've got no gender pay gap, you shouldn't be getting government contracts, in my view. So that's a tweak that we're pushing for as well. And lastly, I would love to see energy infrastructure, which in my view is a public good, be as publicly funded as possible. Because whilst I love the innovation in the private sector, I'm also concerned that we've seen historically huge price rises and private profits, and yet quite expensive energy prices for households. So I really want to make sure that government is investing in that basic infrastructure. So I think the way to make sure we've got gender representation there is to have senior public servants more gender diverse. You still got, as you see in the private sector, it's still mostly men in the senior roles and women in the junior roles. And sadly, even sometimes in the climate NGOs, you've still got, you know, a charismatic chap out the front, but then the women are doing a lot of the work. So, yeah, we need to change that.
It's on that topic of women carrying all of the work, Ange alluded to why we called this report the climate load. And Sarina, I want to ask you about some of the analysis that we found around personal and household contributions to sustainability and reducing emissions, which became a responsibility almost always that falls on women. How do you think we shift this?
So I'm going to put on my social scientist hat here for a little bit. I'm really glad you asked me this question, because when I read the report, I was like, oh my gosh, like this resonates for me on a personal level, it resonates for me on a political level, and it resonates for me on a professional level, like across that whole spectrum. And if I think about particularly the area that I research in and that I guess my kind of expertise is in, which is around agriculture and food systems, and shifting that load from individuals towards systems change, then we know that what is going on at the individual level is really just fiddling around the edges. Until you get significant broad systems change, you're having very little impact in final outcomes. I think that it is a diversity issue in terms of who's in the room when decisions are being made and when policy is being made, because as Larissa had said a bit earlier, if you only have and you as well, Sophia, if you only have a particular type of person in the room, then you're only getting policy and governance mechanisms that serve a particular part of our society. If I think about the food systems change that is needed, we know in Australia that women are more vulnerable to being food insecure. We know that women bear much of that load in the household in terms of trying to make their household food secure. And we also know that just relying on the individual to do that doesn't actually change very much. The biggest thing that has reduced food insecurity in Australia in recent years was during COVID when the Centrelink payment rate went up. As soon as we saw the payment rate go up for the most vulnerable people in our society, we straight away saw the food insecurity rate go down. And guess what happened when the extra money stopped? The food insecurity rate went straight back up again. So I think that is a really tangible, evidence-based example to say that this isn't about individuals managing their household income better or managing their food insecurity better. These are like bigger structural issues, and we need more diversity in our parliaments, on our boards, to get the right people in the room making the decisions so that those decisions serve everyone in our community and in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got another question for all of you. And Larissa, you did touch on this before, but over the past few years we have seen women mobilise in so many ways, through politics, through policy, through innovation, to gain cut through in climate action. And also to bring the public along with them. In your mind, what makes women so powerful in shifting the status quo when it comes to climate action?
That is a great question, but it's also really difficult. But I guess my answer is we're just more powerful than we realise, because without us, everything would fall over. It really would. We do so much, both paid and unpaid labour, to hold up the economy and to keep various systems going. Like, none of that could actually function without us doing all of that work. So I think we don't know our own power, mostly because we're really tired and really busy, as I mentioned earlier, particularly if we've got kids. But I think we're slowly coming into our power and realising that collectively we can really wield that power, and also that leadership doesn't have to be a sort of dictatorial, totalitarian, kind of aggressive, ego-driven style of leadership. That actually leadership can be compassion, it can be kindness, it can be empowering others. And I mean, I have to thank Jacinda Ardern for really kind of spearheading that trend globally of just a more human and caring approach to leadership, which I think is really positive for everyone. So I just hope that we will continue to change culture and support each other and mentor young women, but also mentor young men, as a lady from BZE was talking to me about before, to really change those rigid gender stereotypes. They do no one any favours. They don't help men either. And we've seen in those natural disaster responses that violence increases, and Angela spoke to that in the beginning. And yes, there's an increase in stress and pressure, but because of this toxic stereotype that men have to be, okay and strong no matter what, well, how on earth do they cope in stressful situations? They're not allowed societally to have the full breadth of emotions, which is really restrictive and really, really cruel. So I think if we can try to just try to let people be and stop being so gender stereotypical, we will actually not only reduce violence against women, because you've seen in other countries that the more rigid the gender stereotypes, the greater the rate of violence. So we know there's a correlation there. And so we need to empower both men and women to work together on problems. And yeah, I don't know, I've lost my train of thought there, but I think you know where I'm going. Can't even remember what the original question was. Why are women going to help? Because we're awesome, we have to be, and so we are.
There's an article in that. That headline, that's it.
I think that, Larissa, everything you've said is amazing. It's all about vulnerability and creating space for people to be able to be vulnerable, and women are really amazing at that, and creating space for all people to be vulnerable and lead with that as well. I think that what we're seeing in our system, bringing it back to my experience, I work in the ESG landscape. So, we talk in entrepreneurship about profits and return on investment, but also now we're talking about ESG, and that's my academic background actually. There's actually no E without S and G, and there's no S without E and G, and it's all intersectional, it's all interlinked. And I think women are very good at solving multiple problems at once and understanding that there may be trade-offs in one thing or another, but looking at it through a systems lens. And so that's my answer to the question. And finally, another point is just that I think an equal number of women want to lead and want to step up into their power, but their family structure has meant that they're barred from doing that for whatever reason. I mentioned before about my my parental leave situation with my partner. It's actually not about me. That's about him, right? He wanted to look after our child, but he wasn't able to access the leave. We are structurally in our family incentivized for me to have to take time off my career and for him to go back. It's about him just as much. And so, yeah, just looking at it from both lenses.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Why are women so kick-ass? That was pretty much what it was. It was basically what makes women so powerful in shifting the status quo when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to answer this in the context of agriculture. So I'm part of a couple of research projects that are funded under the Soil CRC, which is the Cooperative Research Centre. And one of the students who I supervise, she's looking at gendered knowledges in agriculture. And what she's found, and this is based on qualitative research, is that women have different knowledge in agriculture. They have different perspectives, and therefore they make different land use decisions. They make different decisions on farm about ethical issues. They make different decisions about animal welfare issues. And this is backed up by the quantitative research that's come out of a different project that's being led by Dr. Hannah-Beth Luke out of Southern Cross University, that's looking at knowledge sharing. And it all turns to the fact that women in agriculture, they know different stuff to what the men know, and they have different perspectives, and it is being able to tap into and amplify and bring up that knowledge that is really going to see us shift towards more sustainable agriculture. And by sustainable agriculture, I'm talking socially sustainable, ecologically sustainable, and economically sustainable. At the moment, there's lots of structural things that exclude women's knowledge from being shared. It might be something as simple as how a field day, which is where farmers will go and visit somebody else's farm to learn something new, is structured. Often no toilet facilities are provided. Not a problem for the men. You pull the car over on the road, you go by the fence. Big problem for women. It's often a clash with women's other responsibilities and multiple roles that they hold on farm. So this might be that field days are scheduled at the same time as school drop-off and pickups, for example. And so those structural designs exclude women from being there. It excludes their knowledge, and therefore we're really losing out this whole wealth of really great understanding of our natural world and business world and social world. And in terms of the climate crisis, 55% of land in Australia is currently used for agriculture. Less than 10% of land in Australia is under nature conservation. So if you want to create a shift in terms of big impact on climate crisis around land use, for me, agriculture is the place to be, just because it has such a massive influence and impact, and women should be there in ag. They should be at the front of making decisions. That means more women on boards, like agricultural business boards. It means more women at those top levels of the research CRCs, which we still see inequity in those. And more women in governance. I'll just keep coming back to that. More women in governance, more women in parliament.
No, I think that's exactly right. I am really conscious of your time, and I don't have my phone. We're good. So I do just want to go to one quick last question for, again, all of you. But it's around solutions and taking those actions. All of you have done that and shown such, meaningful change within your careers. But parting advice for everyone here who are looking to do more, create more impact, and, contribute to our collective pursuit towards net zero. Larissa.
So many things. It harkens back to your point, Sarina, about individual action versus systemic action. I really love when people can pitch in and feel like they're doing their bit. I think that's important emotionally to do that. But you're so right that unless you've got systemic change and unless we stop opening new coal and gas mines, it's going to be a drop in the ocean, whether you've, reused your grey water and remembered to split your plastics when you recycle. So I think we need those big systemic changes. We need to stop subsidising coal and gas. There's $11 billion every year of taxpayer money that gets given to coal and gas companies in accelerated depreciation and cheap diesel. Nobody else gets that. And how dare we use taxpayer money to make the climate crisis worse? It's insane. So we need to stop those fossil fuel subsidies. We cannot approve any more coal and gas. And we need to start that transition process with coal and gas towns as to planning what comes next and make sure that those economies are rich and diverse and are actually reflecting the community's desires for a new generation economy. We need to make women central in that new design process for what comes next. And I really think that you'll see the government cry poor. They can't afford to do all of that. They've got $246 billion over 10 years in the Morrison government stage 3 tax cuts for the very wealthy that are due to kick in next year, that so far they're saying they will keep, and they're saying they're poor at the same time as giving away a ton of money to people that don't need the help. The cost of living crisis is real. It's been compounded by all of the impacts of natural disasters that we've faced. Women are the most poor people in our nation. This is real. So I would love for each of you to go and phone or email your local MP, whoever it is at the federal level, and ask them to not give money to people that don't need the help and to use that money instead to invest in a transition to 100% renewables, to lift the rate of job seeker and to make childcare free. Those are the things that will really make an impact on our climate and on the equality of our society.
Well, it's hard for me to go after you. So what can we do? Because I'm working in decarbonising the hard-to-abate sector, we're really imagining what the transition looks like and trying to make that transition as fast as possible, because maybe we can get to net zero faster than 2050, right? Yeah. Let's be ambitious. So we need to be changing a lot of different things about our consumer choices and about how we vote. We need to be really supporting players and actors that are trying to be in the race to net zero and not engaging in climate delay. That's the biggest piece of advice that I have for people. I think you can very clearly put most of the leaders of the world into one of those camps, both business leaders and political leaders. And once you identify which one they are, it's much easier to understand how they're motivated and how to interact with them. And those who are remaining, by the way, I really do believe that I want to make the most sustainable and the best option for people in the world. It needs to be the cheapest and the easiest to access. And so I think applying that lens as well is also important. Thank you for listening.
I would like to say embrace your full self and humanness and creativity. And a shout out to the Women's Climate Congress, who I know is here in the audience, because it was attending one of their events a couple of years ago that really touched me deeply, because there was poetry and there was music and there was singing and there was art, and I was like, I am totally here for this, because it was framing solutions to addressing the climate crisis across that full breadth and depth of human experience. And I think that's really important for all of us, because if you think that you can sustain commitment to this just from the logic in your brain without bringing your heart and your body and your love for your family and the people around you to that, you are not going to be able to keep going. And there's ups and downs on it. And if you need time to rest and step back, then take that time to rest. But find your new way through it. If your new way through it is to sing in front of Parliament House or interpretive dance a policy, I don't know, but all those are legitimate ways of moving climate crisis solutions forward as full, robust, valuable as well human beings.
If I don't see everyone on the lawns of Parliament House tomorrow, please thank our amazing panel, Sarina Kilham, Sophia Hamblin Wang and Senator Larissa Waters.